I wanted to do just a quick. Nicole is one of the most awesome people I've ever worked for. The first time we ever got a chance to really sit and talk a lot was we were on some trip in, was it Europe or something? Where were we at? I don't know. We were somewhere.
I think Boston.
Oh, it was Boston. That's like Europe. What the hell?
Was it
It was some foreign country. It was Boston.
Was it Ajax Experience?
Yeah, I think it was. That's right. Too many things. And you know, Nicole is just really known in the industry for her knowledge in CSS and all things front engineering technology wise. And it's been a real honor to have both Nicholas and Nicole here, and we're working hard to extend their time here a little further because they've done such a good job with the teams. So we're really, really fortunate to have Nicole here, and I'm just glad that you're here, and I can't wait to hear about performance of CSS and all the things you've learned. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been really a pleasure working with you guys. You're one of the most friendly teams that I've ever been able to consult with. Like, people really wanting to hear, you know, feedback and wanting to talk about stuff. And I've had such a good time in the code review meetings and in the meetings when we figured out like what the code standards are even going to be. It's been a real true pleasure working with you guys. So thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about performance in CSS3 today. They really relate to each other and are pretty connected. But the trouble is with CSS3 is that there's so much buzz around it. It's, you know, the shiny new word. Everybody wants to have it. They're not sure why. They're not even sure what counts as CSS3 and what doesn't. That we don't think about the sort of performance trade-offs that we have for different CSS3 properties versus their traditional image backups. So we'll just talk a bit about that today. So this is sort of a diagram that how I think about things in my head. Like, usually we have this sort of fight between performance and features, but I don't think we should look at like them as being sort of completely opposed to each other, but rather a balance between the two. If we had a site with no features that was super fast, well, that'd be sort of neat technically, but no one would ever use it, right? If we have something that's got so many features that it would be absolutely amazing that users are going, wow, I just wish this worked, you know, that isn't a great user experience either. So it's sort of about finding that middle ground where you decide for each class of users, and that may be by their browser or other technical constraints, what's the best way to give them a balance of features and speed. So here are a few different examples. I think this is too far. These are some comments here, and you know, somebody suggested we just won't have comments for users of IE6. And I thought, that seems like removing some essential functionality, right? So that maybe falls on the other end of the scale of taking the performance side of things too far. Another one, the carrot and breadcrumb trails, so between the levels of the breadcrumb trail. A lot of people would like to insert that using content after. I'd like to do that because it seems really useful, right? And not to have to actually put the character in the code. The trouble is that that won't necessarily be read, and it's hard to have a good fallback for that. You can have an image fallback. It's just something you need to be thinking about. That's one of the harder ones, kind of right in the middle. Gradients, to me, seem like something you can clearly leave off. You know, if a user of IE6 doesn't get a gradient, trust me, it's not going to be the ugliest thing they've seen on the web that day, right? So totally reasonable. Same with rounded corners. A site doesn't look bad if everything's square. It looks weird if you can't get it together to decide on what to do, and you have some things where people tried to force IE6 to have rounded corners and some things where they didn't. Because then you're like, wait a minute, why is it half rounded? But if you just say, you know, for IE, it's square, you know, right up until border radius is supported, we're just square, then things seem to me anyway, look pretty good. Another one is drop shadows. There are some performance implications of box shadows. So that's definitely one that you don't want to try to have a gigantic PNG or something that you use to replace a traditional box shadow. So it's sort of about finding where the user's best interest is. And generally speaking, it's going to lie in the middle. And I think we'll get how many people are designers, actually? Anybody? Yay. Good. Thank you. And everybody else, UIE? UIEs? Okay. Backend? No backends. Okay. Awesome. Well, so often there's this sort of fight between design and development where designers are asking for features and we're saying, no, you can't have it in, you know, back and forth like this, right? figuring out this user's best interest thing gets everybody on the same page, because it isn't about like, you know, killing the designer's cool design, and it isn't about killing our code by making it too heavy. It's about figuring out where the right trade-off is that's actually going to make users happy and give them the best experience given whatever browser they happen to have come to the site in. So this is something that I often get in my first client meeting. Someone says to me, can you please find the selector that slowed down my site and take it out, right? I've had that question so many times. It's sort of like saying, please remove the straw that broke the camel's back. It doesn't work that way. Selectors are more a total amount of cruft you've got going on. So browser does pretty good with handling an increasing number of selectors. And at a certain point, especially older browsers like IE7, just give up. And when you get more selectors than that, they're just not going to handle it well. So you can't think like when you get to that edge there is usually when people call me to come and work with them. And you can't think that I'm going to be able to take off the one thing that you added that pushed you over the hockey stick edge, right? It's sort of about saying like, yeah, we're going to have to work at it, but we've decided we don't want to be above a certain level. So the biggest way to reduce selectors is just to use object-oriented CSS approach, not the framework. The framework is just an example of it, but you guys are already starting to build some of these concepts into your component library, and that's super duper important. You know, if you have two headings that look exactly the same, it shouldn't matter that the part of the page they're on is managed by two different teams. But if you don't have that core set of user interface components, you can end up with a lot of duplication unintentionally. So I wanted to show you this graph. It's from HTTP Archive, which is fantastic for going and poking around and you know, finding out what matters on the web. So this one is tracking render time, and it's trying to figure out what is most correlated with render time. What you're going to see is that CSS transfer size is the most important one when you're considering render time. JS transfer size and total requests come after that. So it's a lot of performance is about what you're sending over the wire. It's a huge part of it. Like, we love to get into the niggly details of like what teeny things we can optimize, but ultimately a huge chunk of the picture is just do more with less code and send less code over the wire. So the good news is that CSS can actually also improve performance, which can be helpful and sort of offset the fact that it's one of the major contributors to bad performance as well. So these are some of the micro improvements. I said there's the big picture stuff, which is like get some of that code off the page, right? But then there are also micro improvements you can make, and some of them do tend to make a pretty big difference. So there are 4 things we're going to think about. Selectors and selector performance, nodes that have a lot of children, double trouble, which I'll explain to you in a bit, and transparency calculations. So first up, selectors. Everybody loves when they're talking about CSS performance to focus on the selectors because it's so measurable and so like nerdy and performance fun. But unfortunately, it doesn't actually have that big of an effect on the performance of the page unless you've got a massive number of selectors as well. Nonetheless, there are some gotchas, so I'll go over those. A few years ago, Dave Hyatt said the sad truth about CSS selectors is that they really shouldn't be used at all if you care about page performance. Things have changed. The browser landscape has changed, and particularly in the WebKit rendering engine, they've made some really great improvements in order to match selectors more quickly, right? Scoping selectors to particular parts of the page and a whole bunch of other stuff that they've done. But it means that we don't have to be as careful as we once did, but there's still a couple things we want to avoid. The thing to do is to use classes. I disagree with him about IDs because they're one-offs and you can't use them twice, but he says basically that you should instead use classes throughout your markup and match based on those classes with relatively short selector strings. The thing that I like that I've seen since I've been here is that the code that's being written recently shows that pattern. Nice short selectors, really clear what's being built. You're unfortunately also dealing with some of the older code, which has really long, complex selectors. So that's going to be hurting your performance, but little by little, as you improve things and move over to components, you will see that improving. So this is the obvious one. Everybody knows this by now, I think. But selectors match from right to left. If you don't know that, that's hugely important, because you can stick a star in here, and basically, because it starts on the right and not all the way over there, even though we might think these IDs would be very, very specific, we end up starting out by matching every single item on the page. And then for every item on the page, we have to check every single parent to see if it has this particular ID, right? So it's actually a pretty expensive selector to match. You want to be more specific about what you're trying to tackle than a star is, usually. Another thing is a selector that looks like a regex. So here we have a couple of attribute selectors for custom attributes, hello and goodbye. If your selector looks like a regex, it's going to perform slowly, right? If it's matching on all kinds of things in different directions, and particularly custom attributes, you've got to be careful about it being slow. So which one of these is going to be worse? div.className or .className? Any guesses? You think div dot will be slower? Yeah, you're right. Div.className gives the browser two things to match instead of one, right? So anytime you give the browser more work, it's going to be slower. So that's something to keep in mind when you're writing your selectors, is that if you can be element agnostic as much as possible, not only do you allow reusability, but you also allow the matching engine to match more quickly. So Opera did a cool project to do tests of CSS selector performance. It was really amazing and sort of the forerunner, but incredibly hard to use. This is what it would output, and you had to look at that in order to kind of figure out what selectors were hard for the browser to match. Obviously, the red ones at the top are worse, down to the faster ones at the bottom. But even still, once you've got handler equals attribute val dot selected, it's a little bit hard to know what that actually correlates to in your style sheet. Most of us don't jump from tokens to examples automatically as a sort of mental translation step. But the cool thing is that Chrome CANARY has built this into to their Profiles tab. So if you go to Chrome CANARY, and it doesn't work that well yet in regular Chrome, the CANARY version is better. You click Profiles, and then you click Collect CSS Selector Profile, and then you click Start. And weirdly, that button will begin to look disabled, but it's not. Yeah, I guess this is the tools that have only just come out, and they haven't quite figured out how they're supposed to work yet. But it does really neat stuff. So then you reload your page to just get the whole rendering of your page happening. And then you get something like this. It's basically a list of your different selectors ordered by the total percent of rendering time spent on that selector. So as you can see on the paypal.com page, the HTML Rosetta div took 10% of the time, right? And do we have any ideas about why that might be, given something I said just a couple minutes ago?
Go to every div.
It's matching every div first, right? And then it's matching every parent node of every div, and it's trying to figure out whether that has the ID of HTML-Rosetta, right? So that's an obvious one why it's expensive. One thing you do want to do is notice that here you have the percent, and it's ordered by that, but here you have the number of matches. So it's particularly interesting to look at cases where you've got a high percentage of total rendering time, but a low number of matches. For example, this beauty here, who had 0 matches and yet took 5.5% of the rendering time. Yeah, so this can be really neat and sort of help you to pick out the selectors that are not great. What I would advise you to think about, though, is don't just match the rendering engine of today, right? Because they're also working on improving these things. If it's going to make a maintenance nightmare in the future, it's not worth it for 5% of rendering time to eliminate that and put in some selector that you're going to have trouble managing later. So really think about the maintenance trade-off. But I think the HTML-Rosetta div would probably be an okay one to get rid of.
So if you add those up, that's like almost 12% of rendering time
spent on stuff that's not actually used on the page. I mean, part of the trouble, and this isn't in the slides, but it's kind of an important thing you might think about, is unused selectors. you guys have a lot of selectors on any given page that are not necessarily used. And the browser can't just ignore those. They're not just like, you know, blah, blah. It actually has to try to match them to everything. So. The other thing that people suggested was important is nodes with lots of children. I don't necessarily buy it, though. So it's Andy Edinburgh, and he did CSS stress testing and performance profiling, a CSS stress test. I think it's interesting to tell you about. It's nerdy and kind of performance related, but I don't think he actually measured what he thinks he measured, but I'll show you all the same. So what he found was that border radius could be expensive, specifically border radius on an element with a large number of child elements. So these are the results that he found. Well, actually, I ran his test on a page of mine. And it's basically, he tried removing certain selectors, and then he scrolls the page like mad, and then sees how the timing changes with a selector in the page versus not. Not 100% convinced that this is actually the way you'd want to measure anything, but it did show some interesting things where you would have you know, some of them with a large number of elements, some of them with a large number of child nodes. What you notice is child nodes seem to affect CSS performance quite a bit. So I think the child nodes thing is the biggest takeaway from what he said, but I also do think that it would make sense to take it with a grain of salt, because I'm not convinced it's 100% usable. So my questions about his methodology are, his results aren't divided by the number of instances on the page, right? So if you have a high number of instances of something that matches a lot, it may take more rendering time to figure out that selector versus one that's not matching. The large number of child nodes, though, I think could potentially be important. So that's something to actually take into account. Finally, transparency is another one that we want to be thinking about. Complicated calculations of what is visible, particularly on animations, are going to be expensive. So if you have it's almost invisible, a rounded corner box, and it's using border radius for those rounded corners, the browser's having to calculate which bits are visible around it and which bits aren't. And if you're using box shadow, it's the same thing, only actually worse, because your drop shadow falls outward onto other elements. That can mean that if you decide to animate your box, for example, it might make sense to take the shadow off, animate it, and then put the shadow back on in order to avoid a sort of jittery flow as the box moves across the page. So just in general, you want to think about anything that would be complicated transparency-wise, complicated for the browser to figure out what would be visible in the view when it's rendered. Well, I guess I kind of slightly covered this in the last one, but double trouble is something to really be careful of. Combining effects can have unintended consequences. So this means you animated something with a box shadow, or you animated something with a CSS gradient. Think about, if you see your animations looking jittery, removing things. So maybe when you animate this, if you swipe across or swipe back, it doesn't need to have a gradient on it. Now, granted, these are browser issues. I mean, if the browser calculates a gradient and then uses it, and that gradient itself isn't animated, then it should treat it like any other image. But in some cases, it doesn't. In some cases, it can actually be kind of slow and jittery. So if you notice that, just simplify the elements that you're trying to animate, and then try animating them that way. Most people, while something's sliding across the screen, aren't going to notice whether it had you know, a box shadow or a similar sort of decorative element. So a while ago on Twitter, I asked people what their favorite feature of CSS3 was, because there's a whole lot of stuff coming out of the working group, and I've had sort of an impression that a lot of it focused around special effects rather than on sort of fixing some of the architectural issues with CSS. But then digging into it, I realized in terms of performance, they're doing a lot of stuff that allows us to replace images, and that's really cool. So I wanted to find out what other people were using. Aaron wrote back to me that he likes that CSS3 allows us to make things look great without tons of images. Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge performance win. If we look again at some data from HTTP Archive, what we'll find is that this bottom part, the biggest average bytes per page by content type, is all images, right? It's a huge part of what we're sending over the wire. I'd argue that JavaScript seems to be growing more, but I think that images are still really important. When you look at those images and you dig down into what those types of images are, what we find is that more than half of them are PNG and GIF. Those are the ones that we're going to replace with CSS3 generally. Most JPEGs are not candidates unless somebody made a really poor choice of image format. And then if we look at the correlation to load time, what we'll see is that that total transfer size is hugely important, which is what we expected, as well as total requests, and then just after that is image requests, right? So if we can reduce the dependence on images, we can really make better browsers a lot faster. It's a little bit harder when we start thinking about, okay, so if we used an inset shadow for the better browsers, what do we do for IE6 or whatever? Sometimes it doesn't matter, but sometimes you will need to think about adding a border that you didn't otherwise need. Design-wise, that might mean that if you have a nice drop shadow, that you need to think about what would be the simpler version of that. Could it just have a single pixel gray border for IE6? Would that be enough so that we can get the good performance win and still have something that looks clean, if not slick like it does in the other browsers? So the highest correlation, again, to render time is CSS transfer size. So I want to show you some of the things that another client of mine did to reduce images. We built their sliders and their password strength indicator using no images at all. So using just CSS3 gradients, border radius, stuff like that. And you get stuff now that looks really slick. We're not in sort of the old days where things would look clunky and weird if you didn't have images. Another one, they were able to do a table with fairly complex headers and borders. And the great thing about not using images is that it's all really updatable and adaptable. So if this gets translated to German, they're not going to find out that their background gradient wasn't big enough. It's just going to grow automatically. Another one that we built out for them was tabs. And so these tabs actually use 0 images as well. Again, pretty simple, but that would have been a lot of images in the past, right? So here we have both inset and outset box shadow, border radius, and borders in order to make an effect that was pretty similar to what they were doing with images before. Another one is callouts. So something with triangles. You can make triangles with CSS using borders. You basically make a square and you make certain parts of the border transparent and other parts visible, and you end up with triangles that don't actually require any images as well. The thing to think about when you're deciding how to handle it is, does the user need that piece of information in order to know what's going on in the page? And so if that triangle is meaningful in some way, then you need to give another way of indicating that, like a text backup or something like that for browsers where it won't work. Or that's more for screen reader users, because triangles are actually supported all the way down to IE5. So that's something that you can definitely use. So Anders wrote back and he said that RGBA was his favorite feature of CSS3. I have to agree with him. That's been one of my favorites too. The reason I like it so much is because I like to code things once and then be done with it. But if I have to constantly be considering, oh, what color is this going to fall on, and how the different colors interact with each other, you can actually end up coding things more than you would need to. A lot of people, so Matt also said RGBA was his favorite. I wanted to show you these ZURB'S awesome buttons. They come in all different colors. He did it as a project to show how you could make a button that could be in different colors. The cool thing is, because of the way they're written, they can also be on any color you want. So they have that flexibility of both background color and the background color of the page. You might be wondering why you would need so many buttons. Most sites don't until they start thinking about branding. If you need branding, then you have to start thinking about how to do that without having your CSS multiply a lot. You don't want to rewrite your button every time a client says that they need a slightly different color for the button. So I'll show you a little bit of their code. It's using, obviously, a lot of box shadow to get the nice rounds and to make it fall on, to make it fall on whatever color necessary. ZURB'S original buttons here use regular colors. They don't use RGBA. So I went ahead and added that in because I knew that I wanted it to be able to fall on any background color. The project that I was working on at the time was going to be branded, and it was actually going to be branded automatically in a tool. So I couldn't know what background color the user would choose. So instead of using those colors, just hex values 999, we go ahead and we put in RGBA with a partial transparency. How many people have used RGBA? Awesome. Great. So really simple. 0, 0, 0, 0. That's just your RGB. And then you set your opacity. The thing I also like about it is that I'm often wrong about the opacity I actually needed. So it means that I can play around with it and figure out what looks good. Border radius. A lot of people replied to me saying that they liked border radius. And I think border radius was in the CSS 2.1 spec, but it's only finally nicely supported across the board. So that's one of my favorites as well. For these buttons, they used a 5-pixel border radius, which is good, except you'll notice that they forgot to put in just plain border radius. So as CSS3 properties are evolving, you have to have the standard in there because otherwise when it comes out, it won't be supported. If you happen to have put the standard in and then the standard changes, sure, you can go back and fix it at that point. But if you haven't put it in at all, you don't have any chance of getting it right. So particularly with something like border radius, where now the syntax has been stable for a long time, you have to go in and put in border radius as well. And CSS lint can help with that if you think you might not have included border radius everywhere that you've included the vendor-specific properties. You can run that and find all of the examples where you need to add a vendor-specific value. So we go ahead and put in Moz, WebKit, and normal, and that makes the buttons more future-proof than they would have been before. There are some oddnesses with border radius. If you have very different sizes of borders on the different sizes, browsers will handle the curve between those borders differently. What you want to do is look if it's making sense for that browser to even have that visual effect, given how it handles it. So, this might have been meant to look really nice, but that's obviously not how you would want it to look on a browser. So it might not be worth it to have the variable sizes of the borders for that particular browser. Another gotcha is how the inside behaves. So you may have your nice curve on the outside, but the inside is square because the border is thicker than what your curve radius was. You can get around that a little bit with using background colors instead of actually using borders. So here you can see an example of that. These two boxes have border radius set, but the browser, when it's doing its calculation, is not understanding that those are meant to be right next to each other, and is actually popping a few pixels of the background color through into the space between the two borders. The way to handle that is usually to trick the browser and to set the background color of the green box to blue, and then the background color or the border of this to set the inside border of that space, and then set the background color again back to white. It's a little bit painful to have to do it that way, but some of the effects just don't work if you're doing something kind of pushing it far to see how much you can get out of a particular part of the spec. Another thing you might try if you're struggling with border radius is that box shadow can look an awful lot like border radius. If you do low spread and you do low blur, you can actually use box shadow to add two borders to any element, one on the inside and one on the outside. So that can be helpful for dealing with some of the weirdnesses around border radius as well. Next up, gradients. So Dan really, really loved gradients. I love them too, but wow, the syntax makes my brain melt. Yeah, but you know what? Better that they settle on something and stop changing it so that it can be standard and we can start, using it across the board. Then we have some perfect syntax later. I'd rather have it stay the way it is and just start using it. How many people know Leah Veru? Do you know of her? You totally should. She's doing some amazing stuff. This is her name, Leah Veru. She's Greek. She made all of these patterns that you see on here and many, many more using gradients. It turns out that you can use gradients to make stripes, you can use it to make plaid, you can use it to make a checkerboard. The examples on her website are mind-blowing. Like, at one point I asked her, like, how did you even get from, okay, gradients to, I'm going to make stripes and plaid with that? And she said it just sort of happened by accident. She was adding values in and she got stripes unintentionally. And then she was like, oh, wow, and thought, what if I take those stripes and flip them plaid, So really, really, really cool stuff. The thing to keep in mind with this is that because the syntax is so big, you have to write so much to get one of these things to look a particular way, it can be pretty easy to go over the size you would have had for an image that did the same thing, right? Yeah, she's pretty good. She actually won't let anybody post. So now she's collected them. She started off doing maybe 15 herself, and now she has a bunch of people who've been adding to her site for that. And she won't let anybody get on there that's over 2 KB. So yeah, any one of these was done with less than 2 KB of code. Yeah, pretty cool. It does get a little hard to let designers work with it if it's written like this, right? Unless they get familiar with it too. It can be a little bit difficult to have revisions happen if this is in your CSS code rather than in an image directory.
That's a good reason to do it, right?
Huh?
So that's a good reason to do it, right?
Okay. So yeah, this is the syntax. So you're going to do basically color stops, and then you're going to say for each of the, oh, this is the old syntax. Crap. Don't look at that. Don't do it like that. But you know what? You actually don't have to do it at all. There's a tool. Well, so let me tell the story the proper way, the way it happened. I tweeted, I need a tool where I upload an image of a gradient, and it spits out the CSS required to create that gradient. Does this exist? Like, I was spending hours, like, tweaking all these values in the gradient, trying to get it to match basically these legacy sites that had used image gradients before. And I'd get it so close, and then I'd show it to the designer and be like, that's not the same at all. I can't do it. So in frustration, finally tweeted, like, save me, this needs to exist, right? And 12 hours later, Philip Tellis, who is another, he's incredible. I mean, brilliant, brilliant guy. He was just like, oh yeah, and I should tell you first, the first thing he asked me, I think, was, what's a gradient? So he went from what's a gradient to okay, I wrote a tool to do what you wanted in 12 hours. Like, wow, that's just incredible. And he open sourced it, right, so anybody can have it. The thing is, it's command line only, so that isn't going to necessarily work for a lot of people. So the guys at Colorzilla saw that and thought, well, fantastic, that's not so different from our gradient tool. And they actually added image upload to their tool. So you can go ahead and point them at an image and upload it to their site, and they'll give you a preview of it, and they'll tell you exactly the code that you need to create it. Even better, they give you all the vendor prefixes. So this is Opera, this is Microsoft, WebKit, whatever else. So really, really useful for converting legacy sites. The one thing I will point out to you is that all the values for where the color stops are done in percentages, which isn't how an image gradient would behave. Sometimes it can make sense to translate that to pixels or to set your background sizing property to make sure that it doesn't grow to whatever container you happen to have stuck it in. Otherwise, the legacy and the newer way of doing it will not always match. Ooh, one more gotcha. Filter. It spits out a filter for IE because IE had the ability ages ago to have background gradients. Don't use it. Do not, absolutely never use that. Copy paste this and cut that bit out. It causes so many rendering bugs. You'll have like 1 pixel between this and that and no idea why in the world. There's nothing in the CSS that'll say why there should be a pixel between 2 things. and it turns out that on one of them you used a filter property. So absolutely not worth it. Much, much better idea is to just say versions of IE that don't have support for background gradients don't get background gradients. If it's absolutely essential to the branding, then go ahead and include an image, if that makes sense. But it really should be a case where the site and that page wouldn't look the same at all if it didn't have it. OK, so that's the link to the ColorZilla tool. And I'll send off my slides after this. So don't feel like you have to take it down. I'll give it to, send it out to the list. So another thing that's great is better support for advanced selectors. We've had to do a lot to work around the support issues, right? Classes like .last, classes .first, classes even, classes odd. We can be done with that now. You don't want to use nth child in some really, really crazy way, because you may notice that that pops up to the top of your list as one of your slow selectors. But when you do things like matching every other row, it's a whole lot better, because when you update the table contents or add rows or remove rows, it's just going to fix itself, and you're not going to then have to parse through the whole table, swapping evens for odds and that sort of thing. Yeah, so I have to agree with Joss that last child and first child are something that I try to use as much as I can, but I also try to be careful. What you can do is understand that the bottom of whatever you're creating doesn't matter as much as the top of what you're creating. So usually the top edge of something needs to be perfect in order for it to fit with everything else, in order for it to look good. It's the part the user will notice first. But if you have a box that might have an extra line below it if, for example, last child isn't supported, that's okay if that is anyway going to be below the horizontal scroll, right? So if you have a choice between first and last child, make it so that it works perfectly on the first child. And if you're going to have a slight bug for IE, have it be in the last child. And it's sort of less, I don't know, less visually ugly and more acceptable. OK, the other one that a lot of designers replied to me, loving, 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 is all the font stuff. I don't get it. I don't get it at all. Well, I started to understand typography and that it actually matters. But people do go a little overboard with fonts and thinking that that's sort of the be-all, end-all. On a lot of sites, fonts just don't matter that much. I think it makes sense first to test it, A/B test it. If users don't behave differently, lots of smiles for this one. If users don't behave differently when they've got fonts, then why put them in there? Huh?
He's living through this right now.
Are you living through this? Yeah. The other thing is don't put a font on everything, right? Like, so maybe some key headings, go ahead and put a fancy font, but don't put it for your basic page type. Unless it's like a really artsy site, and then that can kind of make sense. Yeah. I don't know. And the other thing is there should be a trade-off, right? So if you're going to use typography as your major visual key, then you should take out something else, right? It isn't like, and on top of all the visual flourish we have, now we also have crazy fonts. It should be a kind of trade-off to find that middle ground we were talking about before, where it's the best interest of the user, where they're getting a visual experience that makes them buy more, makes them happier, makes them more productive on the site, whatever it is the goal of what you want them to be doing. But not so much so that they're sort of overwhelmed with visual effects. And then, you know what? Trade off by having less HTTP requests, things like that that you can do that'll make up for the fact that fonts are actually pretty heavy. OK. Thank you so much.
3 minutes for questions.
Sorry. I tried to go fast so that I'd fit in some
No,
time.
we started late.
We did, yeah, so I couldn't quite
That's awesome.
talk fast
So
enough.
we can open it up for questions.
Yeah.
Sure. On the phone. Nothing in the room?
On the filters, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So even IE9 doesn't support that. So would you recommend, when we go for images, that's additional HTTP request,
It is.
What's the trade-off? Are those requests, what's the lesser evil?
I think the lesser.
Repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. Oh, can I? So he's asking basically when we try to decide whether to use background gradients, what is the lesser evil of adding HTTP requests for older browsers that don't support gradients versus other options, right? Okay. First thing I'd think about is how much does that gradient actually matter to the user? Do you see when you take it out and there's no gradient, does the user behave differently? Does that gradient change how much they shop? Does it change how much they engage with the page? Does it change anything about their behavior whatsoever? If it doesn't, then that's not a gradient to keep, right? That's a case where it's a nice to have. It sort of makes the page look slick, but doesn't seem to actually affect anything in terms of user happiness, right? If it does affect user happiness, if in that A/B test, it comes back that people shop less when there's no gradient on a particular rounded corner box, notice the smile, then in that case, you might want to think about data URIs in order not to have at least the HTTP request, but that will add weight, right? So, yeah, that's how I'd handle that. First up, try not to have it. Second up, if you have to, try not to have the HTTP request. And finally, if all else fails, keep that image as small as you possibly can. And run it through like a PNG crush and things like that to get every ounce of weight off the image. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
More of a comment than a question.
Sure.
For Mark, but we have designers, we have web devs, and we kind of know now what to expect in these IE7s and IE8s who don't support most of the CS3 stuff. But I still get tons of bugs from QA because they still don't quite understand that I'm not going to do border radius for either. I don't care if it doesn't work. Let it be squared. They are so used to see that this mock, this is the browser. I don't care which browser it is. You just make it work. And that is something that is still lacking. I don't know how we can communicate to them and how we can educate to them that this is not the way we are going to code anymore, and just accept that those browsers are not going to do it. Probably give a list of those browsers to them that don't look for those styles in those browsers.
Yeah.
It might make sense to give visual examples too, so that they can look at a document that says, okay, here's my round in a good browser, but here's what I should expect it to be in other browsers.
And not to say bad things, but we have been using CS3 since some time now, and I would have assumed that by now they would know that it doesn't work that way.
I don't think there's enough education across to that team.
And I'm not sure if it's right to tell them how CSS3 works or how much information we should communicate to them, or what is the best way of doing that. I don't want that they are not interested, but we need them to know.
Yeah, but if they're testing web UIs, they don't
should
have a
be
choice to be interested.
Yeah.
Right. So
It's a job requirement to be interested.
so I agree. I'm going to take that to some folks in QA and find out what we can do. But I kind of like that thought of this is UI spec and this is probably an addendum, which is this is how this is going. Because we could easily run it in a few browsers and do screen grabs of those little modules, right? And say, okay, this is what it's going to look like, guys. What do you guys know?
And also something that Nicole said earlier is that if we can help work with UED to figure out what that expected degradation would be, like maybe we have it in the actual spec that a single gray border may work for older browsers, then we can expect that to be the fallback behavior.
For CD2, we have a table with, browser support for every CSS3 feature that we're using. We're saying, okay, if it's IE6, you're going to expect this. If it's, and then I've worked with in my particular stream, I've worked with QA and sat down QA and the designers and said, okay, here's your image here. It looks great here with CSS3. This is what it's going to look like in IE6. Please don't file any bugs, because you already know this is what it looks like. And then the designer's right there nodding their head. And so that's kind of one way we've been able to mitigate that kind of friction.
It seems like it has to be the designers and the business buying off too, right? I mean, if Yeah, they gotta sign off and they gotta agree to say, okay, we're gonna be okay with.
I think they sort of have agreed, but QA is somehow unaware. I think
Okay.
it's that kind of a thing where
Yeah.
the design team has said that they want
They're
that,
fine with
that's the
that.
right thing to do, but somehow bugs are, maybe there needs to be a new category of closing a bug too, so that it's clearly within the realm of, you know, some sort of category of, you know, this is a progressive enhancement thing and close it. Yeah. Then too, you could track how many things are coming up that way and know where your education needs to be. Like, you know, maybe they're specifically looking at gradients or rounded corners, and you could do like a little 15-minute workshop on fallbacks for gradients or rounded corners. Something like that. Cool. Well, thank you guys for having me.
Thanks for having us.